Okay, now we have our ingredients. That's fine. But what happens now if we put them together? If we put two or more ingredients together, do they compose something new? A further entity? That is the special composition question.
Obviously, cooking is a very complex and extremely demanding process, at least if one tries to attain or approximate almost level. But arguably, it is possible to analyze the concept of cooking in terms of putting two or more ingredients together so that they compose a new whole. Arguably, composition is both necessary and sufficient for cooking. But this then obviously raises the question, what is composition? Or even more so, the question, when do two or more things together compose or constitute a further entity? Is it sufficient that they are merely mixed? Or should they really dissolve, or what?
The special composition question in metaphysics is, when do different bodies or chunks of matter, particles, form together another body? And there seem to be many examples of this. If I have a proton and an electron together, that's what we call a hydrogen atom. If I put two hydrogen atoms together, I have a hydrogen molecule. Hydrogen gas consists of hydrogen molecules. So it seems indeed that we compose little things and then they get more encompassing things. Or think, for example, of a bicycle, right? It consists of many parts and together they form a new object, the bicycle, right? And so the question arises, under what conditions do separate pieces of matter, separate objects, form together another object? And metaphysicians have been looking for that.
Let's first have a look at moderate answers to the special composition question. The question when mereological simples or mereological atoms together constitute a new entity, when they together compose a new entity. So intuitively speaking, you could say that there are positive examples. So when, for instance, two or more bricks, a number of bricks together, when you arrange them in the appropriate way, they constitute together, they compose a wall. Okay? So that would be a positive example. But there are also negative examples. For instance, the camera and my shirt do not together constitute, at face value at least, a further object. They do not compose an entity. Okay? So now we are going to look for criteria or a criterion to distinguish those cases in which mereological atoms compose a new entity, a further entity, and those cases in which they don't. And this turns out to be very hard. For each possible or conceivable criterion, you can find counterexamples. So for instance, let's take a well-known criterion, candidate criterion, and that is contact. Two or more mereological simples or mereological atoms compose a mereological sum if and only if these mereological simples are into contact with one another. Okay, so here is the example of the bricks composing a wall again. They are brought into contact with one another, so in that sense they meet the criterion, and we intuitively consider it a case of mereological fusion of composition. So this works well. But then, just suppose that you and I shake hands. Then we are into contact with one another. So according to this criterion, at that time, we compose a new entity. You and me, whoever you shake hands with, together with those persons, you compose new entities. That doesn't make sense. At least that's not intuitive. Okay? And the problem now is that, as I already indicated, that for each possible criterion for composition, each candidate, you can find such intuitive counterexamples.
Well, I'm quite happy to allow sort of a positive answer to the special composition question. I do think there are composed objects. Now, of course, there's going to be limits upon how many composed objects there are. So I don't want to say that any particulars can come together to form some new thing. But I think most of those limits that are there, we should probably look towards some of the sciences to help us out. So I'm not too sure that we can, by a priori means, work out which composed objects there are. I think that's something we need to go hand in hand with our sort of empirical cousins to help us with. I think that whether something can be a composed object is to do with whether there is a kind of that sort, whether that kind exists. And I think that what kinds exist is at least partly an a posteriori matter. So I think that Kripke was in some sense right, that we can go to the world and we discover that there is the kind water and the kind tiger. And whilst there might be some kinds we can work out through a priori reasoning, it's probably somewhat limited there. And so the job of the philosopher is to give us the structure, the metaphysical, formal ontology that we can then engage with the scientists and with the empirical work to see what the actual categories are. So there's kinds, but which kinds there are is a different question.
And probably by now you know the drill. When we are looking for a criterion and we can't find one, or at least not one that is satisfying all our intuitions, we always consider, in almost all debates, we consider the option of thinking that it's not possible to put the finger on a criterion because the very thing we are trying to analyze is primitive. And that's exactly what has been proposed in this debate, the debate on the special composition question, by Marcosian. He argues for what he calls brute composition. So indeed, sometimes mereological simples or mereological atoms compose a mereological sum. Sometimes they don't. But you can't put the finger on a criterion for that. It's simply, it's a primitive matter of fact whether certain mereological simples compose a further object, a further entity, a mereological sum. Another way out is to develop a radical view, not a moderate one, trying to find a criterion, not primitivism, giving up on criteria altogether, but a radical answer, saying, for instance, like mereological nihilists, that mereological simples or mereological atoms never compose. So this view basically argues that everything there is are mereological simples. Okay? And that means that everything there is are entities that do not have proper parts. And a proper part is something which is a part of something else and not identical to that something else. Okay? Of course, mereological simples are identical to themselves. So, in that sense, they are part of themselves, but not proper parts of themselves. So this is the radical view known as mereological nihilism. Van Inwagen, who more or less raised the special composition question, Van Inwagen argues against mereological nihilism in the following way. I, Peter van Inwagen, exist. Second premise, I am not a mereological simple, meaning there are parts of me that together compose me. So I have proper parts. Therefore, there is at least one object in the world that is not a mereological simple, and therefore mereological nihilism fails. Exercise. Evaluate this argument.
Extreme position is called mereological nihilism, because mereology is the study of parts and wholes and composites, and nihilism says never. So rather than saying an electron and a proton, they form a new object, a hydrogen atom, those people, nihilists, say no. There's only an electron and there's only a proton. And they are arranged hydrogen atom-wise. But there's no new object, a hydrogen atom. That's a mistake. Okay.
Of course, there is another alternative, a radical alternative again, and that is saying that all problems can be solved if we allow any mereological simples or mereological atoms to compose with each other. So, according to mereological universalists, any two mereological simples or any two or more mereological simples compose further entities. So, think again of the example in the beginning. The camera and my shirt, they do compose an object, a further entity. And then think again of our counterexample to the criterion of contact. When the two of us or any two persons shake hands, according to the mereological universalist, they do compose an object. Okay, so this is mereological universalism, and it has been defended, for instance, by David Lewis.
And the other extreme position is universalism, that says any two objects form a new object, right? So me and the planet Venus, they form a third object. Okay. And usually the motivation for this is given, we cannot find a general condition that objects have to meet in order to compose a new object. Okay? And so the idea is that it's all arbitrary, and so stop doing it, and every two objects, they form an object. Okay? So one thing that you can have in mind is things form a composite if they are very close together, right? So me and my jacket and my glasses, that forms one whole. But now suddenly a leaf from a tree drops on my shoulder. So it is also in contact with me. So do we now have a new composite object? So intermediate distance sounds absurd. Now there is one philosopher, Peter van Inwagen, he said, objects together, they never form a composite object, except in one case, when the composite object is alive. Only then. Yeah? So I'm alive, I count as an object. Right? Tim de Meij is alive, he counts as an object, etc. Bacteria, they also count as an object. But a mountain is not alive, so there are no mountains, there are only elementary particles arranged mountain-wise.
Now, Peter van Inwagen himself, Peter van Inwagen who raised the question, special composition question, has yet another moderate answer, but a very special kind of moderate answer. Namely, he argues, or his idea is that mereological simples compose if and only if their activity constitutes a life. And that's why in the previous section, his idea, I exist, I am not a mereological simple, makes sense according to his own theory, because obviously his parts, Van Inwagen's parts, together perform activities and they constitute a life. The life of Peter van Inwagen himself. So basically the idea is that parts form an entity when that entity is a living organism that functions, that is alive. That is his special answer to the special composition question.
So I think his solution's a bit strange, partly because I am unconvinced that persons are a particularly special kind. So I'm quite happy to accept persons as a kind, but I'm also quite happy to accept chairs and tables. So I would actually probably allow for a lot more composed objects than him. And I'm yet to be convinced that the sort of specialness of people warrants us being the sole kind of composed objects. But I'm going to go with him that there are some. I don't want to be a nihilist about this, but nor do I want to be an unrestricted mereological compositionalist and think that there are almost an infinite number of composed objects.
I have a different solution. And this solution is based on physics, and it says that if the bodies, the separate bodies, they interact in such a way, yeah, in such a way that the potential energy of the individual bodies is negative, yeah, then the bodies form a composite whole. And in physics this is called a potential well, and if a particle or any body is in a potential well, this is called a bound state. So all objects on planet Earth, dead or alive, you know, they do not fall off the Earth because of the gravitational force, but another way of saying this, they all have negative gravitational potential energy, right? And so we and the Earth and everything on it counts as an additional object. Yeah? The proton and the electron that I started with, the electron is in the electrostatic potential well of the proton. It is in a bound state, and that's what keeps them together, really. So the fact that they are together is a consequence of the fact that the electron is in the potential well of the proton. So that counts as a whole. Yeah? Molecules, they are held together by forces. They are also in a negative electromagnetic energy potential. Yeah? So all sort of the intuitively composite objects that we see around us, trees, bacteria, human beings, mountains, they are all held together by the electromagnetic force. And they all count as composite objects. See? So that is my solution. I think the solution is provided by physics.
So basically we have 5 answers to the special composition question, ideal for multiple choice questions. A, always, mereological universalism. B, never, mereological nihilism. Then, moderate answers, advancing criteria such as, for instance, contact. Then, primitivism, brute composition. It exists, but we can't spell it out. We can't put the finger on a criterion. And finally, Van Inwagen's own answer to his special composition question, mereological simples compose when, if and only if, their activity constitutes a life.